So welcome to the U.S. Peace Council report back on the official delegation of the U.S. Peace Council to China. 4 members of the U.S. Peace Council Executive Committee and Secretariat traveled to China from November 22nd to the 26th to meet. This was an invitation, an official invitation from the Chinese People's Association for Peace and Disarmament. And so throughout those days, there were many meetings that were held to discuss a number of issues, as well as time spent visiting and seeing some of the modernization efforts that China has undertaken. So we wanted to do this official report back to share with you what our members of the delegation learned while they were in China, and to affirm our commitment that was made on this visit to maintain communication with the Chinese People's Association for Peace and Disarmament, and to find ways that we can collaborate to work for peace. We are, of course, very concerned about the state of the world right now, and it's important that we step up our efforts to work for peace. And so today we're going to hear initially from Bahman Azad. Bahman is the Secretary General of the U.S. Peace Council, and he'll provide an official overview of the delegation. And then the 3 other members of the delegation will give their remarks covering specific issues that were discussed during the visit. After that, we will take questions and provide answers to those. And if you have questions, you can please share those using the Q&A tool, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and I'll be able to see that. So you'll see a little Q&A, click on that, and you can write your question in there, and then I will see that. So why don't we go ahead and get started? Bahman, you can take the floor.
Thank you very much, Margaret. Unfortunately, I have to announce sad news that last night, the former president of the U.S. Peace Council, Comrade Alfred Moder, passed at the age of 102. Comrade Al was a driving force and a co-founder of the U.S. Peace Council and a vice president of the World Peace Council. And he had a tremendous and critical role in leading our efforts for peace for many decades. We have had a tremendous loss because of Al's death, and we are hoping that we will continue his path during the course that comes in these troubled times. U.S. Peace Council has issued a statement about his passing that some of you may have already received and some of you may receive in the future, but it will be posted on our website as well for everybody to see in terms of the role that Alfred Moder played for us and for the peace movement in the U.S. and globally. I will try to be very brief and just give you an overview of the trip, the visit, the background to the trip, and some impressions that we had as a delegation from our China visit, and leave the more detailed discussions to my colleagues who were part of the delegation, and also to question and answer period. The issue of our visit to China was on the agenda for quite a long time. Actually, CPAPD had invited us and was talking about inviting us to China for quite a while, but the reason for the delay until November of this year was the fact that China was facing a restriction on international travel because of COVID. So as soon as the doors opened, comrades facilitated the process, and we managed to travel to China. This was a very important trip, especially with regard to the present global situation. It was based on the mutual recognition that the key role being played on the international scene right now that will determine the future course of our humanity is being played by China and United States. And the relationship between the two countries is very critical with regard to further developments in the world. We both understood and that people-to-people relationship between the two countries is a key element in this process, especially for maintaining peace, because unfortunately in the United States, certain ruling circles are presenting the China's rapid development and its role in the international arena as a threat to the interests of the United States, which is not a correct assessment. It's a falsehood. It's negatively intended. And for that reason, both sides, we found it important for us to have a meeting to discuss in whatever ways we can to cooperate in any way that we can to reduce tensions and promote peace between the two countries and throughout the world. Our delegation was invited to have five member as a part of the delegation. Originally, two of our comrades, Henry Lohendorf and Margaret Flowers, were scheduled to go, members of our secretariat, but due to conflict of schedule, it was not possible. The fifth person in our delegation, Comrade Dan Kovalik, had even obtained his ticket and he was ready to go, but due to his previous trip to Egypt in support of Palestinian cause, and the complications that were involved there, he was delayed in his return and was not able to participate in the delegation. The real objective of this trip was to create an atmosphere of closer cooperation between CPAPD and USPC as a member of the World Peace Organization, World Peace Council, to facilitate to develop some kind of a concrete plans of cooperation, which was also based on the necessity of the better understanding of the situation in both China by us and in United States by our comrades in China. So the meetings that we had involved in-depth discussions that we had with the Chinese counterparts. And I can go over the schedule that we had briefly to tell you what was discussed and the topics that we covered, so we have a better understanding of the complexity of the issues. Our delegation visited China and we went to two different cities in China. First, we arrived in Beijing and we stayed there for 2 days and then traveled to Shanghai, and we were there for 2.5 days. And during the Beijing stay, which was mostly the formal part of our discussions, our meeting, the first meeting was a mixed kind of physical Zoom meeting between CPAPD, USPC delegation, and some China scholars stationed and based in the United States in Washington, D.C., which focused on the question of U.S. politics and the relationship between the United States and China. The second part was actually a formal bilateral meeting that we had with CPAPD, and the general topic of it was the President Xi Jinping's theories about building socialism with Chinese characteristics for the new era. Of course, this was a general topic. The issues that we covered were quite multifaceted, which included the question of China's global security initiative, China's peace efforts, China's diplomatic efforts, China's modernization process, the question of the global peace movement and the ways to strengthen and promote it. So various aspects of these topics were discussed among us, and we came up with some general agreements on some of these issues. Of course, as a peace organization, the question of socialism in China is not something that relates to us as a peace group. It is the Chinese people's right to decide which path they want to adopt for the future of their socialist system. But the principles that are behind that general direction in many ways are compatible with everything that we in the U.S. Peace Council and generally the peace movement supports, which is a peaceful settlement of all differences, independent development of all nations, and peaceful negotiations between the United States and China, and putting an end to the potential Cold War. So all of these issues, which are integral parts of President Xi Jinping's theories and thoughts, are of course agreeable to all of us, and we agreed on promoting these aspects of the thoughts together in collaboration with each other. I just try to be brief and just lead this whole issue to some practical agreements that we made for cooperation. Of course, we agreed to work together very closely as a matter of principles, and we have a lot of deeply shared principles that join us together for peace and security of the world. But practically, we agreed to expand people-to-people exchanges between the two countries. CPAPD and U.S. Peace Council will work to facilitate the visitations on both sides to the other countries, especially by the youth of both countries, to visit the other side and get familiar with the developments that are going on and the general public opinion and everything else. The second thing was a question of organizing, again, official exchanges between the two organizations, more delegations to better familiarize ourselves with each other's situation. We agreed to hold joint webinars and seminars about the situation in China, about U.S. China relations, about peace between the two countries. And we agreed to work together in terms of constant communication and exchange between the two organizations to update our partners about the situation in the U.S. and China, with the purpose of debunking the whole idea of China being a threat to the United States because of its development and its growing role in the international arena. So these are the things that we agreed on, and we are dedicated and committed to advancing this cause of peace between China and the United States in the future. I'll stop here and let our comrades give you more detail about the various aspects of these discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Bahman. Yes, I had really hoped that I could participate in that delegation, but I was not able to do that because of family commitments. I would next like to invite Ajamu Baraka. Ajamu is a member of the Secretariat of the U.S. Peace Council, and he is the chair of the Coordinating Committee of the Black Alliance for Peace. Ajamu is going to talk about diplomacy and the Global Security Initiative. Ajamu?
Thank you, Margaret. And thank everyone for joining us for this important conversation. As Valman laid out, this was a very important delegation establishing relations between our two organizations both organizations, of course, committed to the cause of peace. In that process of interchange, we had a chance to examine a number of issues related to peace. And we engage in a conversation with our Chinese counterparts as it relates to some of the major theoretical and political ideals and concepts and approaches that they have been grappling with in attempting to address the objective needs for an international peace movement. So there were two areas that I was given the responsibility to lead the conversation. Most of all of the delegates had various areas that we focused in on, but of course it was a very wide-ranging conversation. So I'm gonna share those ideals that we shared with our counterparts in China during this first day primarily, but throughout the entire visit. There was two areas that I'm going to touch on. The areas of diplomacy and the global security initiative. On the issue of Chinese diplomacy, it's important to note that the Chinese approach is a significant departure from the crisis-oriented zero-sum diplomacy that is characteristic of diplomacy emanating from the West. This is a very important element to address in our discussions, and was a very important element that we discussed, since both of our delegations and our hosts are committed to ways to maintain international peace. What is clear is that on the issue of diplomacy, there is a fundamental divergence in core values. I found that principles as articulated by President Xi Jinping reflected an approach to diplomacy that was grounded in the commitments to, one, and this is not comprehensive, but the most important ones that jumped out to me and to us was first, building a community with a shared future for mankind with a view to defending world peace and promoting common development. Secondly, pursuing peaceful development on the basis of mutual respect and win-win cooperation. Third, steering the reform of the global governance system under the principle of fairness and justice. In contrast, U.S. diplomacy has as its core value a system of values that is informed by the doctrine of full spectrum dominance, a military political doctrine produced by the U.S. Department of Defense that had at its genesis in the worldview and principles of the neocon project for a new American century that has now become an essential feature of the U.S. national security strategy. Dominance was seen as encompassing elements beyond just the ability to project U.S. military power globally, but to also include economic, political, and even cultural dominance through the use of information, media, and entertainment, and all aspects of knowledge production. It is a doctrine that explicitly sees the rise of any regional power as a threat, despite its political and ideological orientation. So while it would identify Venezuela as a threat for U.S. regional hegemony in the Americas because of its socialistic orientation and capacity to galvanize resistance to U.S. hegemony, U.S. policy also will and did see Ethiopia on the African continent, a government largely committed to economic policies that could only be characterized as neoliberal, with a political orientation that could not be characterized as radical at all, still, nevertheless, found itself on the receiving end of U.S. subversion. Why? Because of its size and growing friendlessness toward China. We have witnessed concretely the results of the Chinese approach with the historic agreement brokered by the Chinese between Saudi Arabia and Iran that effectively ended the Obama war in Yemen. So these are some of the principles we saw and we talked about regarding the issue and the approach of diplomacy that separated the U.S. approach from the Chinese approach. The other fascinating initiative that we discussed was the Global Security Initiative. Again, this was introduced by President Xi Jinping. The Global Security Initiative is seen as a basis for structuring a new global security architecture that corresponds to the challenges of this historical moment. President Xi advanced 6 principles that are defined as commitments that, if adhered to, would theoretically provide security for states and peoples. 1, it is necessary to stay committed to the vision of common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security, and work together to maintain world peace and security. 2, it is necessary to stay committed to respecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries, uphold non-interference in international affairs, and respect the independent choices of development paths and social systems made by people in different countries. 3, stay committed to abiding by the principles of the UN Charter, reject Cold War mentality, oppose unilateralism, and say no to group politics and bloc confrontations. 4, it is necessary to stay committed to taking the legitimate security concerns of all countries seriously, uphold the principles of indivisible security, build a balanced, effective, and sustainable security architecture, and oppose the pursuit of one's own security at the cost of other security. 5, stay committed to peacefully resolving differences and disputes between countries through dialogue and consultation, support all efforts conducive to the peaceful settlement of crisis, reject double standards, and oppose the wanton use of unilateral sanctions and long-arm jurisdiction. And 6, it is necessary to stay committed to maintaining security in both traditional and non-traditional domains, and work together on regional disputes and global challenges such as terrorism, climate change, cybersecurity, and biosecurity. What we discussed was that for the issue of diplomacy and any global initiative for security, it is necessary to correctly contextualize, without any sentimentality or idealism, the objective realities of this historical moment. What informs and shapes contemporary reality of this at this conjuncture is the ongoing crisis of global capitalism and the transition from Western colonial capitalist domination of the last 500 years to a new power configuration and social systems that have not yet taken a permanent form, but nevertheless are in dialectical emergence. The rulers of international capital, primarily based in the US, are no longer fit any longer to rule and impose their conditions of existence upon the societies and nations of the planet. The last 4 decades of neoliberal policies favoring capital has seen neoliberal financialized capitalism turn into an unproductive plunder as a result of losing its productive dynamism. Therefore, we argue, unilateralism, hegemonism, and power politics, including the attempts to impose a so-called rules-based international order, where the US and its Western allies make the rules and enforce the order, cannot be understood outside the context of ongoing and deepening crisis of the international capitalist order and the increasingly desperate and dangerous attempts by Western imperialism under the leadership of the United States to prevent this inevitable historical transition. It is this context of national class struggle that contextualizes any discussion of the security of states, international law, or the role of the United Nations. The dialectics of the global class and national struggles make it very difficult to establish a permanent security architecture unless it is grounded in a firm commitment on the part of a majority of global humanity to enforce adherence to the progressive global values and to end impunity. The genocide taking place in Palestine right before the eyes of the world, with the non-Western world seemingly unable to come to the aid of the Palestinians and to bring the perpetrators of the war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide to justice, is a graphic example of the disparity between the commitments to new global principles and the concrete material force needed to protect the security of states and peoples. It is the plight of the Palestinian people a domestic internal affair for the state of Israel, or a threat to international peace and security? What about the security of the peoples of Haiti, as the United Nations has given a green light to the U.S. and the oppressive core group members to engage in a violent intervention into that nation in order to prop up an illegitimate government and deny the agency of the Haitian people to govern themselves? Peace, and I'm heading toward the end of this. Peace, security, international development, and human rights were the four interlinked pillars of the United Nations system. Yet, the naked exposure of the power politics that reflect the unequal relationship between the West and the rest of the world has shaken the faith in the UN system and the utility of discussions on human rights and peace. Peace and human rights are still laudable goals, but what I shared with our Chinese counterparts was that without global structures of non-state popular accountability, grounded in the principles that we discussed in China, global humanity will be unable to manage the momentous changes that we are currently facing, and it will be impossible to manage those changes in a way that would reflect a commitment to peace. I share the definition of peace from the Black radical peace tradition. Quote, peace is not the absence of conflict, but rather the achievement by popular struggle and self-defense of a world liberated from the interlocking issues of global conflict through the defeat of global systems of oppression that include colonialism, imperialism, patriarchy, and white supremacy. This approach to peace is a call to action, a call for strengthening the ties among the peoples of the world, but its implications regarding the enemies of peace are absolutely clear and will not be wished away with the incantation of words, no matter how advanced and correct those words might be. Peace and imperialism are an irreconcilable contradiction. Peace that is sustainable will only emerge out of the crucible of the global anti-colonial, anti-imperialist struggle that sees the victory of the organized peoples of the world. That is the task, that is the mission, and that is the responsibility of the international peace movement. That's what we left in our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ajamu, for that excellent presentation. And next, I would like to invite Emmanuel Ness. Manny is a member of the Executive Committee of the U.S. Peace Council, and he is the chair of the New York Peace Council. Manny is going to be talking about the modernization of China and peace. Go ahead, Manny.
Thank you very much, Margaret. I would like to focus on modernization because I think it's extremely important to recognize the nature of the Chinese state and the leading role of the Communist Party of China in leading the modernization efforts through a set of principles that I found to be extremely and highly important. We should make no mistake about it, according to our interlocutors with the CPAPD, that China is a socialist country. China is a socialist country, and one of the main aspects of it is that it reflects the characteristics of China. So that was, I think many people are familiar with the moniker of socialism with Chinese characteristics. I certainly found that to be true. And I particularly was impressed by the presentation by Pu Zhuangxi in presenting this, which reflects the position of the General Secretary Xi Jinping that was laid out in the 20th National Congress of the CPC. So there were 5 principles building on this question and the point that the CPC is a Marxist party, it is a socialist party, but it is a Chinese party as well in terms of its characteristics. And so there is a blueprint for development that was set forward by the Chinese state and the Communist Party of China that are based on 5 principles, which I think most of us agreed, I think every one of us agreed with. First is the significance and importance of independence, that every state in the world must have its own independence and its own way to advance modernization. And China's path to modernization is one that was developed within Chinese socialist culture. And it is reflective of the national conditions of China, which are very different than the national conditions of the imperialist countries, for instance. So here we have a country with 1.4 billion people, more than that, that has brought at least, well, its entire population out of poverty. This was a project that has taken place many, many years, 78 years. And it is, actually working. But one of the key elements of it is the independent role that China and the CPC has been able to advance in building a society that is modern and that can be utilized by all people and accessed by all people within the Chinese society, not just a few. This is one of the goals for the next 5 years. The second, also one that you might have heard of, is the notion of common prosperity. I was very impressed by that because many of us have read about this point, and we believe that or at least I believed, and I think we agreed, that the idea of promoting social equity, justice, and promoting common prosperity for all people within China was a very good blueprint that was appropriate for the Chinese system. And I think actually I would add many other countries throughout the world that are seeking to advance themselves, that are in the global south and the third world. The third would be peaceful development. So peace becomes a very important aspect of this, but I think it's very important for you to recognize that peace and development must recognize the past plunder that the Western modernization programs have engaged in over a period of 150 to 200 years. War, colonization, plunder, and control over countries through militarization has created a highly divided world, one in which most of the world is highly poor and the rest of the world is rich and doing well. So the idea of human progress, the idea of creating equity, not just equity within a country, but equity amongst countries, came across to me as being extremely important, that this notion, this theory was put into practice within China, and it was done so independently of other countries and without the interference of other countries. So I think this was a very important aspect. Peaceful development means non-interference in the internal affairs of countries of the global south and the world as a whole, and that was one of the important aspects of creating a sense of peace. And then again, the fourth was the openness and inclusiveness question or issue, that modernization can never occur without many different types of socialism emerging, perhaps. There may not be one socialism for every country around the world. There isn't one blueprint, but there are many blueprints, and China certainly has, I think, a very strong and advanced blueprint based on what we discussed and what we saw. And it is based on an idea of, as I pointed out, common prosperity, but also an idea of how nations can engage in exchange, as was noted earlier, and engage in learning to advance those principles. And that's based on mutual respect and so forth. In light of this, China is developing global partnerships, enhancing political mutual trust. I think that's important, and deepening political cooperation with other countries, all countries around the world. And that level of trust, which I just pointed out was the fourth principle based on openness and inclusiveness, reflecting the points that Bahman and Ajamu made earlier, was based on the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, something that has been abrogated by the West. I won't mention any specific names because we try to have a harmonious relationship with our interlocutors. And the fifth idea of modernization under socialism was working hard in unity. So in this case, it's very important not to have splits and rifts and partisanship that we find in the West. Especially, we as Americans know that in the United States, we have one policy one day and another policy the other. In the case of China, under their socialist and democratic system, they have a continuous system in which people can expect what they have agreed upon. And this was very clearly seen both in our discussions and also through our observation of how this was put into practice. So again, no blueprint for every country, but there should be some level of continuity, and one cannot expect one day to be on peaceful terms and the second day to be on warmongering terms. So that was a very important aspect of the discussions, and I think should be pursued further in other delegations that come into being in the months and years ahead. I'm going to be speaking very briefly about Xi Jinping's discourse on peace. It was largely revealed by my predecessors on the delegation, Bahman and Ajamu, but it's one of the areas of peace is through building unity and trying to foster modernization in places that are actually backward economically. So one of the areas of peace that China is trying to advance it should be made very clear, in a peaceful way, in a way that's non-confrontational, in a way that does not seek to gain power over any other nation or war in any other context. But the Belt and Road Initiative is one that actually was advanced as an aspect of the peace approach that was advanced by China and Xi Jinping. I think I might be closing this now because my time is up, and I want to leave time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Manny. And just a reminder to folks, we have one more speaker and then we'll take questions. If you have a question, please type it in the Q&A, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. There's a Q&A icon. Click on that and write your question. So next I would like to invite Roger Harris to speak. And Roger is a member of the Executive Committee of the U.S. Peace Council, and he's also a member of the Task Force on the Americas. Roger is going to be speaking about the U.S. China relationship. Thank you, Roger.
Thank you, Margaret, and thank you, everybody, for participating on this webinar. And I especially want to acknowledge and thank our Chinese hosts. They were very generous, and we had incredibly productive relationships with them in dialogue. And I want to talk about particularly bilateral relationships between China and the United States. I'll be repeating some of the principles that some of my colleagues have already spoken about, but in some ways these principles bear repetition. The Chinese view the relationships between the United States and China as the most important, the primary relationship in the world. To quote President Xi Jinping, he said, "How China and the U.S. get along will determine the future of humanity, will determine the future of humanity." That's how important those two relationships, the bilateral relationships between the U.S. and China are. The Chinese recognize and celebrate, in fact, that there's a very high level of integration between China and U.S., particularly in the area of economics. They view the economies of the two countries as intertwined. They both see that these intertwined relationships are positive, that they result in the mutual benefit of both countries. And this is somewhat different from the U.S. position, more than somewhat different, I should say. The guided principles for the U.S.-China relationships is based on a concept of coexisting in peace and having friendly and cooperative relationships. And they have a number of, they have these, what they call the 5 pillars of U.S. relations. And I'll just emphasize 3 of them. And these are the ones that they feel, if implemented correctly, will result in the common prosperity, not only of the U.S. and China, but of the entire world. The first is mutual respect. And under mutual respect is a very important principle there, and that is recognition for red lines. The Chinese recognize that it's not all happiness between the U.S. and China, that each country has mutually exclusive red lines, and that these have to be absolutely respected. If they are not respected, cataclysmic consequences are possible. Peaceful coexistence is the second of their main principles. And there they talk about the very high importance of mutual communication, dialogue, and the ability to adjudicate disagreements by diplomacy and not by military means. And the third is, and was mentioned already before, but I'll mention it again, is that they view the entire world system as one of win-win cooperation. That they feel that the both countries can advance mutually and through beneficial cooperation. And some of the areas that they view where it's absolutely essential that the United States and China cooperate in mutual cooperation is some of the major world problems, these intractable world problems, such as global warming. They feel that you can't tackle the issue of global warming without U.S.-China cooperation. Another emerging area would be AI technology, and they feel that that's an area where the two countries need to cooperate on so that the world will benefit. And they feel that the United States and China, just because of their predominant positions, their huge economies and stuff like that, that they have global responsibilities. That being big takes on a responsibility to take on global issues, the issues of humanity, which they feel cannot be solved unless the U.S. bilateral relations with China are cooperative. They're also aware that the Biden administration, and by extension, the United States in general, the U.S. establishment, has a different definitions of what U.S. China bilateral relationships look like. And they view that the United States, and correctly I would say, view that the United States sees the relationships not as cooperative, but as competitive. And they call that a zero-sum mentality. I'll get back to that in a moment. And that where that zero-sum mentality goes to, it provokes rivalry. It doesn't provoke mutual benefit. And finally, they feel very important that they should be promoting people-to-people exchanges. That's precisely what we have the privilege of doing now. And the Chinese are hoping, I noticed that in the Q&A already, Sharon Rose had a question about student exchanges. And the Chinese have announced that over the next 5 years, they'd like to bring 50,000 U.S. students to China to study in people-to-people exchanges. So how do these principles apply to reality? And I want to use an example of the recent APEC conference. The APEC is the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Conference. It was held just a little bit over a month ago, November 15th, in the San Francisco Bay Area, where I'm speaking actually. And the two presidents of the two countries, they met together at the APEC conference, and location not all that far from where I'm speaking right now. It was an important meeting because this was the first time that the two presidents had a face-to-face conference in over 2 years. And there's been a lot of tensions between the two countries. And we don't know what happened in those 2 hours of closed discussion. But we do know what happened after it, because both of the presidents spoke. My president, Joe Biden, said, and I quote him, he said, well, look, he's a dictator in the sense that he is a guy who runs a country that is a communist country that's based on a form of government totally different from ours. That was what Biden came out of the bilateral discussions with the Chinese, with President Xi Jinping. That evening was at a dinner hosted by Friends of China, involved U.S. Council for Foreign Relations, Chamber of Commerce, and other groups like that. And he, in a way, responded to Biden's very undiplomatic comment about him being a dictator, or at least he broached that topic in what I would call a very profound and diplomatic way. He said, quote, "It's unrealistic for one side to remodel the other. The planet is big enough for our two countries to succeed. The planet is big enough for our two countries to succeed." So there's two themes. On the U.S. side, there's this idea that the bilateral relationships with the two countries are a zero-sum game, that the role of the U.S., according to our national security doctrine, is, quote, full spectrum dominance, and that the objective is to contain and compete with China. On China's side, there's a different view. It's a view of mutual benefit. And there's some reality to both views. But on the economic side, we have to recognize that there's a very high level of mutual economic dependence. There's, especially in the areas of trade and secondarily in the area of investment, there really are symbiotic economic relations between the two countries, and these should be built upon. Goods produced by U.S. corporations in China that are used in the United States are very important for our standard of living. In fact, President Xi mentioned not at the APEC conference, but prior to that, he said, "What would happen if the Chinese cut off the U.S. supply of iPhones? How would people feel about that?" And then there's also a lot of U.S. corporations who have offshored their manufacturing in China, and then bring those products back to the United States. If those were cut off, the standard of living and the quality of life in the United States would be significantly changed. But it's on the military area, which is probably of the greatest concern, and certainly the concern of those of us working for peace. And I wanted to quote a study that was done by a group called the RAND Corporation. The RAND Corporation is a semi-governmental think tank. It's associated with the U.S. military, the Pentagon, and this particular study that I'm going to talk about was commissioned by the U.S. Army, and it somewhat reflects what official U.S. thinking is on China. And the title of the study tells you it all. The title of the study is War with China, Thinking Through the Unthinkable. Thinking through the unthinkable. So this RAND study, a bit over 100 pages, goes through a number of different scenarios of what a war with China looked like. These are Rand Corporation gets the best mind that money could buy. And they figured out, well, how many people would be killed, how many factories would be destroyed, how much military equipment would be deployed. And they worked these scenarios. And they said, at the end of the day, the US would prevail. That war between the two countries would be devastating, but that China would lose more than the United States. It would be hurt more but with the United States. In that study, however, there's a caveat. And this is the very important caveat for us to understand. The caveat is, if the conflict between China and the United States is contained. And that's why the issue of red lines is so important, because if the conflict is not contained, and the Grand Study makes it very clear that as the conflict heats up, it becomes harder and harder to contain a conflict that can go to nuclear war, a conflict that can involve other countries. And the Rand Corporation also points out that the incentive when you get into a situation like that is to make a first strike. It gives the first strike country a huge military advantage. So here we have a choice between win-win, mutual cooperation, or a zero-sum game. And that's where the peace movement and the people of the world need to tell our leader that we want peace and not war. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. So now we'll take a few questions, and to remind folks, if you have a question, just use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, click on that, and you can type your question in. The first question, actually, she had two questions from Sharon. A quick question is, how did you communicate with the Chinese delegation? Were you using interpreters, or did you speak in English? And then the second question that she had was regarding students in China and U.S. students in China, Chinese students in the U.S., that there seems to be a trend where that is decreasing, and your thoughts on what's driving that, what's behind that. So I'm not sure who would like to begin, if any of you have thoughts on student exchanges. I see Manny, go ahead.
We did not discuss that issue that you raised that was reported in the New York Times, which I view as a mouthpiece of the U.S. government or stenographer. Yet at the same time, I think we have to acknowledge the fact that the United States has restricted students from entering, Chinese students from entering the United States and engaging in scientific research of various forms. So first of all, I really can't confirm any statistics that the New York Times puts forward, and that was not part of our discussion. The other was many people in China speak English fluently or in one way or another, as well as people on the street, ordinary people.
Can I add, Margaret?
Yes, please do, Bachman.
The way it happened that mostly in our less formal exchanges, our Chinese colleagues spoke in English. But in the formal meeting, usually especially the General Secretary of the Deputy General Secretary of the CPAPD and other leaders of CPAPD spoke in Chinese, and there was an official translation. So that's how it went.
Thank you. We have a few questions from Alexis, and Alexis wanted to know a few things about if you discussed the stance of China on what's happening in Palestine right now, as well as China's position on the United Nations, particularly the UN Security Council, and if there needs to be some sort of restructuring there. So Palestine, the United Nations, and then finally the question was, China's policy is not to intervene in the affairs of other countries, but if China were to go, I guess, to the help of another country in the global south militarily, what might be the impact of that on the Western imperialists, and would that give cause for a greater conflict? So I don't know who wants to begin, take any of those three.
Well, I'll begin with the last part of that question first. I don't see any scenario anytime soon where the Chinese would violate some of their core principles regarding the use of military force by coming to the aid of any state militarily at this point. They're very much committed to attempting to make to remind the UN and to develop the UN's capacity to adhere to its own principles. Peace is a fundamental pillar of the United Nations. They are committed to reviving the spirit of the UN Charter, so I don't see that happening anytime soon.
Great, thank you, Ajama. Did anyone want to speak to whether you discussed Palestine, or did you have discussions on that?
I will briefly respond to the question of Palestine. No, we did not have a discussion of what is happening in Palestine, but generally, Chinese position is in support of the people of Palestine and their rights, and that is the general argument that they had. But we did not get into details, especially a one-state or two-state solution. That was not necessarily the topic on the agenda, and the issue was not debated at all in any way. But if we put the Chinese position in general in the context of the UN Charter and international law, so far as China is concerned, as far as I can tell, they are in favor of the UN resolutions with regard to the question of Palestine. And so far, I haven't heard anything contrary to that. And this is what the majority of the world states still hold on to. So, but there was no particular debate over the solution. Probably the more urgent issue is now stopping the bombardment than finding the ultimate solution for the problem.
Right, and then a next question from Paul was wondering about whether, if you talk to people outside of the delegation, people who live in China, and when it comes to peace, what kinds of attitudes or positions did you find with respect to their thoughts about China and to their thoughts about the United States when it comes to peace?
Well, we had a wonderful visit to a community in Beijing, where we in fact had a chance to talk with the residents in that community, and the response that we got was that everyone seemed to be very much committed to the idea of peaceful relations between the U.S. and China. And there was no hesitation in discussing various issues, but we saw a highly organized community that was structured in such a way where all of the social services needed for the residents of that community was in walking distance. It was very impressive when we went to Shanghai and was exposed to the rationale behind their urban development, where by law, communities have to have within a 15-minute walk access to all of the critical social services and facilities that are needed, healthcare, education, elder care, you name it. So we had a chance to, I mean, it's a very quick trip, of course. So we did have a chance to have some interaction with ordinary Chinese.
Did anybody else want to share their experience? Roger, go ahead.
Just an anecdote. When we were in Shanghai, I took a little walk on my own around the neighborhood that we're in, and I just sort of casually mentioned, this relates to social services. I just casually mentioned at the dinner table that in some ways it was not that different from downtown San Francisco, downtown Shanghai, except much bigger, but that there was a conspicuous absence of homeless people. And one of our Chinese hosts said, "Oh," and I should tell you that Shanghai has about the same weather as San Francisco, and at that time it was just about the same temperature in San Francisco as it was in Shanghai. So one of our Chinese hosts said, "Oh, well, you know, we don't have homeless people because, I mean, in this weather they would die of exposure." And I just didn't have the heart to say that in San Francisco, people die every day from the disease cold exposure, something that our species had learned to mitigate when we went into caves. Yet we're back to that stage there. So just an anecdote.
Thank you. And then a number of questions are regarding kind of, where we go from here. So I wanted to begin with a broader question, and then if you don't answer the other questions, I'll narrow it down. But the United States national security strategy at this moment is great power conflict, which means conflict with countries like China, like Russia, and so given that, and given kind of this current environment of retaliation against people who speak out about that, speak out against that, organize around that, and this kind of misinformation machine that we have going on in the United States, what is your advice to folks in the United States? How should we keep informed about what's happening between the U.S. and China? How should we, organize in this environment? And what would be, some next steps that we can take?
Maybe briefly, I ask for help from other comrades. One thing I should mention, which was very prevalent in all of the discussions we heard from our Chinese colleagues, was that they were kind of in shock or could not understand why the U.S. does not want peace with China. In many ways, the question always was that we are pursuing peace. We want diplomacy. We want a win-win relationship. We want cooperation. And we do not understand why the U.S. is resisting it. And if you look at from inside the United States, look at the picture, the propaganda constantly is about Chinese threat, Chinese threat, Chinese threat, as if a natural development of a country on its own is a threat to another country. And the Cold War mentality is being intentionally promoted and distorting China's reality. As we saw it, it's a peaceful country that is aiming at developing its economy, its society to the benefit of all of the people, which is 1.4 billion. And they don't have any animosity toward any other country. And in fact, they are trying to help many other countries. And it seems to me that the question should be asked not in the form of what is going to happen, but what is our responsibility toward what will be happening. And for that purpose, I would stress that the forces of peace in this country have the historical responsibility of presenting the reality of China to the American people, to presenting the peaceful intentions of China to the people of this country, and debunk this whole Cold War mentality that is constantly pushed. we need to create an atmosphere of openness to the facts and truth. And I think from our point of view, I mean, that was our commitment to the Chinese CPAPD when we came back, that we will do our best to kind of remove the fog of misunderstanding that is being promoted inside the United States about China, and push for a better understanding of the reality, peaceful reality of China, and peaceful development of China, and its benefits to the people of the United States, rather than as a threat. And this threat is coming, not even the threat is not against the people of the United States. It's a threat against U.S. domination. And I'm sure the ruling circles will not tolerate that, but the people of the United States can push it on the leadership. Thank you.
Would anybody else like to respond to that?
Only that when one moves across China, and we had a chance to move a little bit in the trip from Beijing down to Shanghai. And when you remind yourself that the ruling class in the U.S. has committed itself to global hegemony, you see in the countryside of China and in its cities why the ruling element is so concerned about the Chinese and about China. What we saw was, in fact, the consequence of a society fully mobilized to put the interests and the needs of the people at the center. One in which the commitment to development was a priority. One in which if the rules of the international order were allowed to function, that they are quite confident that they will continue to be able to develop and to bring prosperity to their people, but also perhaps serve as a model for other nations who are grappling with some of the same kinds of challenges of poverty and underdevelopment because of their relationship to more powerful forces. So the commitment on the part of the U.S. ruling class to use military force to thwart the activities of the Chinese requires the mobilization of opinion among the public in the U.S. So it requires these distorted notions of the Chinese. It requires that the aggressive ambitions of and commitments of the U.S. state for hegemony is then reversed and projected onto the Chinese, so that the U.S. becomes the victims, the ones that are in opposition to the aggression coming from the Chinese or the Russians or whoever. So as Bauman shared, these kinds of interchanges are important. We would probably suggest that if one wants to understand China, that perhaps the last place one would go exclusively will be to the channels of the bourgeois press. That what you have to do is seek out information from alternative sources to see what is really happening, not only in China, but really in all of these nations that the U.S. has identified as their national, their global, and regional competitors. So it was an eye-opening experience, and one that put into sharp relief why we see the aggressive nature on the part of the U.S. As it relates to China and the people of China.
Great, thank you, Jamu. So folks are wanting to know, I have a question here from Reverend Dordal. I hope I didn't mangle that name too much. Just, are there any specific plans for future meetings with the peace movement in China, or was there any kind of a specific plan going forward to maintain that dialogue and work together?
I can respond to that. Yes, actually, as part of our discussions for closer cooperation, we discussed the possibility of U.S. Peace Council hosting a delegation of CPAPD to visit the United States and visit with our peace movement. And also, the CPAPD colleagues raised the possibility of inviting another delegation of U.S. Peace Council to China in 2024. They told us that this is only a part of things that you have seen, and there's a lot more for you to see in China. And indeed there was, and we know that. So we are looking forward to that possibility of exchanges, but not only between the two organizations, but we agreed that if possible, we should kind of organize people-to-people visits as much as possible between the two countries, because it is our understanding that is only through mutual understanding of the peoples that peace can be maintained, and it is the people of the United States who can put a leash on what the leadership is doing now toward China. And for that reason, I think our responsibility towards peace between China and the United States is much heavier for us on our side, because we have a negative propaganda being pushed inside the country to distort the minds of the people about China. But Chinese don't have that problem, because the whole state and the people are for peace with the United States. And for that reason, we are going to do our best to facilitate as much as possible the exchanges between the people of the two countries.
Comment and follow up on that. Kiana had asked if there would be delegations that the U.S. Peace Council organizes that people could participate in. Will those be open delegations?
We are hoping for that. As you know, we did the similar things when we sent a delegation to Venezuela, which was consisting of the leadership of the many different peace organizations in the U.S. We did more or less the same thing with Syria. So as the doors open and we managed to put the infrastructure for exchanges together, we definitely will work together to facilitate that kind of exchange as well, definitely.
Great. And then two more quick questions. One is China's position on nuclear disarmament. The other one is from Pierre, wants to know, are there particular research or studies that we should be looking at in the U.S. on ways that we can foster cooperation and peace in the world? I don't know if anybody wants to. I mean, the Chinese organization is that has disarmament in the name, so assuming that helps. Does anybody want to? Manny?
We only discussed the question of nuclear weapons with respect to the fact that the United States surrounded China with nuclear warheads in the Pacific, the Indian Ocean, and beyond. But we didn't get into any discussion whatsoever on that subject. That was not picked up. With respect to Pierre's question, I think it follows the previous one. And, I think we need to develop a number of resources on understanding the Chinese people and its leadership, as well as the Communist Party of China, its high level of democracy on a local level, which I think many people don't know. And, I'd be happy to share that with you if you'd like. I think you have my email.
Great. And Danny made a comment that in China, there are public restrooms everywhere. Just another difference between China and the United States. Danny's from New York City, where it's not easy to find a public bathroom. So I think those are most of the questions. We didn't want to let this run too long. We appreciate everybody being here. This is going to be posted on YouTube later, so you can share that out at the U.S. Peace Council's YouTube channel. And I think Bachman alluded to this, but I just wanted to reiterate that, you know, as part of our commitment to working to build peace with China, we hope to be organizing more events like this, where we can bring speakers in who can discuss, you know, and expound further on these principles that we've touched upon today, and provide some more of that information that people need in the United States, so that we can have a different understanding than what we're offered in the corporate mainstream media about what's happening right now. And so I want to thank everyone for the speakers. I want to thank you for participating in the delegation, and also thank the Chinese People's Association for Peace and Disarmament for inviting the U.S. Peace Council. We really appreciated that invitation. As Bauman said, we hope to be able to do the same here, and we're going to continue to work together to work for peace and cooperation in the world. So thank you, everyone, for being here tonight.